The PlayStation 1 launched in 1995, and nobody could have predicted that Sony would enter the market and completely dominate their competition, but there was a system in 1995 from Sega that a lot of people seem to think couldn't compete with the PlayStation 1 when it came to 3D graphics, and that's not entirely true. So we're going to talk about the Sega Saturn in this video, and we're going to break down the 5 best games that demonstrate the 3D graphical capabilities of the system. The Sega Saturn was a home video game console developed by Sega, released on November 22, 1994 in Japan, and May 11, 1995 in North America, and July 8, 1995 in Europe. It was part of the 5th generation of video games and was the successor to the successful Genesis. The Sega Saturn had a dual GPU architecture and 8 processors. Count them, 8 processors, folks. Its games are CD-ROM format, including several ports of arcade games and original Sega titles. Development of the Saturn began in 1992, the same year Sega's groundbreaking 3D Model 1 arcade hardware debuted. The Saturn was designed around a CPU from the Japanese electronics company Hitachi. Another video display processor was added in early 1994 to better compete with Sony's forthcoming PlayStation, and this is where a lot of the issues happened when it comes to the Saturn, because at the last minute they added another chip, another CPU into the Saturn during its development, during its manufacturing, to compete with the PlayStation 1, and that guaranteed 2 things. 1, that the Saturn would be much more expensive, and 2, it would be much more difficult for developers to fully utilize. The Saturn was initially successful in Japan, but not in the United States, where it was hindered by a surprise May 1995 launch, 4 months before its scheduled release date. After the Nintendo 64 was shown off in late 1996, the Saturn rapidly lost market share in the US, where it was discontinued in 1998. A total of 9.26 million units were sold worldwide. The Saturn is considered a commercial failure. The cancellation of Sonic Extreme, planned as the first 3D entry in Sega's popular Sonic the Hedgehog series, contributed to its performance. The Saturn, of course, was succeeded in 1998 by the Dreamcast, and we all know how that went. So now that we have a brief history of the Sega Saturn and its development and those 8 processors and the 1 CPU added in at the last minute to compete with the PlayStation 1, the idea of 3D graphics and acceleration for PlayStation 1 took over, and in the minds and hearts of gamers, the PlayStation 1 was the more popular, more powerful system. But I think in the right hands, Sega Saturn really showed off what it could actually do. And on paper, the PlayStation 1 was weaker than the Sega Saturn. So let's take a look at the 5 top graphical 3D games for the Saturn. 1998 saw the release of an action game developed by Sonic Team and published by Sega for the Saturn. Burning Rangers is set in a futuristic society in which fire is the remaining danger. Players control one of an elite group of firefighters, the Burning Rangers, who extinguish fires and rescue civilians in burning buildings. Most of the tasks the players complete are centered around collecting energy crystals to transport civilians to safety. In lieu of any in-game map, Burning Rangers features a voice navigation system which directs players through corridors. Producer Yuji Naka wanted to create a game which involved saving people rather than killing them. Sonic Team chose to connect the game with firefighting, as they thought it was an effective way of having players identify with heroism. It was released in Japan in February of 1998, and later that year in North America in May, and in Europe in June. Burning Rangers received mostly positive reviews. Critics unanimously commended the game's soundtrack and audio, with the voice navigation system receiving particular praise. The response to the graphics was mixed, with some critics feeling they were among the best on the Saturn. Although it was noted for its poor collision detection and occasional glitching, the game was among the final 7 Saturn games released in America. Even though this game received mixed reviews for the graphics when it released, I think over time, and especially now looking back at it, pushing entire 3D levels was absolutely incredible, and there was very few games like this on the PlayStation 1 that did it as well, even though there were a few problems. I think this is one of the best looking games on the Sega Saturn. What do you think?
Coordinates set.
Coordinates confirmed. Transport. Transport complete.
Sonic R is a 1997 racing game developed by Traveler's Tales and Sonic Team and published by Sega for the Saturn. It is the third racing game in the Sonic the Hedgehog series and the first to feature 3D computer graphics. The player races one of 10 Sonic characters in various Sonic-themed racetracks as they attempt to stop Dr. Robotnik from stealing the Chaos Emeralds and enslaving the world. Sonic R features single-player and multiplayer game modes, and while similar to kart racing games such as Mario Kart, it places an emphasis on jumping and exploration. By collecting items and completing objectives, players can unlock secret characters. Sonic R was the only original Sonic game released for the Saturn. 3D Blast is a port of the Mega Drive game, and Sonic Jam is a compilation of the first 4 mainline Sonic games. Initial reviews for the game were mixed, with retrospective reception being more negative. It was praised for its visuals and level design, but criticized for its poor controls, high difficulty, and short length. Looking back at this game now, this absolutely demonstrated the 3D capabilities of the Saturn, and if you look off into the distance as you're moving through the level, instead of pop-in, they sort of perfected this sort of phase-in effect when it came to the textures and the 3D models, and they're kind of transparent, and then they draw in. It was a neat effect and a way to handle pop-in that nobody else really did, and definitely demonstrated that the Saturn was more than capable of 3D visuals and could stand up to the PlayStation 1. But I'd be interested to know, what do you think about Sonic R? Those of us old enough to remember Lara Croft, yep, she got her start on the Sega Saturn. In 1996, action-adventure video game developed by Core Design and published by Eidos Interactive. As the debut entry in the Tomb Raider media franchise, it was first released on the Sega Saturn, followed shortly by versions for Microsoft and the PlayStation. The game follows archaeologist adventurer Lara Croft, who is hired by businesswoman Jacqueline Natla to find an artifact called the Scion of Atlantis. Gameplay features Lara navigating levels split into multiple areas and room complexes while fighting enemies and solving puzzles to progress. Reception of the game was very positive, with praise for its innovative 3D graphics, controls, and gameplay, and went on to win several industry awards and is considered one of the greatest video games of all time. The game is one of the best-selling video games for the PlayStation, with 7 million units sold worldwide, but Lara got her start on the Sega Saturn. And looking back at this game, totally 3D, the environments, the design, the character, the exploration and gameplay, the Sega Saturn could more than handle these 3D engines. And when a developer with the right amount of expertise dug into the Sega Saturn, the results were something spectacular. But what do you think about Tomb Raider on the Sega Saturn? The Sega Saturn was initially designed as a 2.5D machine, 2D graphics with some light 3D elements, and once PlayStation 1 and the specs were revealed, Sega got a little bit scared and put that extra chip in there, but I think no game demonstrates what the Sega Saturn was really designed to do better than Nights into Dreams. In 1996, the action game was developed by Sega Team and published by Sega for the Saturn. The story follows the teenagers Elliot Edwards and Clara Sinclair, who enter Nightopia, a dream world where all the dreams take place. With the help of knights and exiled Nightmaren, they begin a journey to stop the evil ruler Wise Man from destroying Nightopia and consequently the real world. Players control knights flying through Elliot and Claire's dreams to gather enough energy to defeat Wise Man and save Nightopia. The game is presented in 3D and imposes time limits on every level in which the player must accumulate points to proceed. Nights into Dreams received acclaim for its graphics, gameplay, soundtrack, and atmosphere. It has appeared on several lists of the greatest games of all time, and a shorter Christmas-themed version, Christmas Nights, was also released in December of 1996. I gotta be honest with you, this is one of those games that I have a love-hate relationship with. As I said, I think it demonstrates what the Saturn was designed to do perfectly, but I do not like time limits in levels and games. I feel like they rush me through there. I have a sense of panic when I just want to explore and take in everything that the game has to offer. I'm still thinking about that time limit, and I get why it's there to push you through a level, but ultimately, I feel like this is one of the games that demonstrates how technically capable the Saturn was. What do you think? Virtua Fighter 2 is a 1994 fighting game developed by Sega. It is the sequel to Virtua Fighter and the second game in the Virtua Fighter series. It was created by Sega's Yu Suzuki-headed AM2 and was released for arcades in 1994, and a port was released for the Sega Saturn in 1995. Virtua Fighter 2 was critically acclaimed for its gameplay and breakthrough graphics. It introduced the use of texture-mapped 3D characters and was one of the first video games to use motion capture animation technology. It became a major arcade hit, selling more than 40,000 arcade units worldwide and becoming one of Sega's best-selling arcade games of all time. The Sega Saturn version was also well received for its graphics and gameplay. It became a blockbuster hit in Japan and sold relatively well in other markets, selling more than 2 million units. I don't think there's a better example of the Sega Saturn's 3D capabilities than this game. Let me know what you think about Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn.
1. Ready, go!
No way you can.
So those are my top 5 graphically impressive games on the Saturn. As always, those are my picks. Let me know if there are games that you feel should have made the list. Thanks for watching this video. Think about liking and subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.